My name is James Milner. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at Carleton University. And it's my distinct pleasure to have been asked to say a few words of introduction for our keynote speaker, the Honorable Mzee Abdulrahman Kinana. But before I do, there are just a few housekeeping words that I'd like to add. First of all, the welcoming words of greeting from His Excellency the President of Tanzania, His Excellency President Kikwete, arrived by email within the last hour. So in between trying to resolve Côte d'Ivoire, he has not forgotten us here at Carleton or there in Dar es Salaam. So we have an electronic version of very detailed opening words from President Kikwete. So those of you here at Carleton who would like to receive the text of this statement, please make sure that we have your email address and we can forward it on to you. And for colleagues in Dar es Salaam, if you would like to receive a text of the presentation, Carol, I don't know if I can add yet another task of the multitude of areas of help that you've already given to us, but perhaps we could send a copy electronically to Carol, and through our friends at the Canadian High Commission, there may be a way of distributing it locally. We've just lost the connection, so those words of imploring Carol for her help have disappeared, so I'm going to repeat them as soon as they come back. But until then, that's all from London. No, you're right. There we are. Very good. So as I was saying, if it would be possible, if those of you in Dar who would like a copy of the text of President Kikwete's opening message, if you'd be kind enough to be in contact with our colleagues at the Canadian High Commission, and we'll ask to distribute the text in that way. And as the most recent interruption in our link makes clear, this kind of technical link with Dar es Salaam does not happen easily, and we are very, very grateful for our colleagues here at Carleton and in Dar es Salaam who have facilitated the technical aspects of this work. And while we still have the connection, I'd ask you to please all join me in thanking our technical colleagues for this work. Now, as I mentioned, it's 9 o'clock at night, it's 10 past 9 in Dar es Salaam. This is the last session where we will be video linked to Dar. However, we know that the final session will be a spirited end to our discussion, or perhaps a new start to our discussion. So please remain in contact and keep an eye on the webpage for the Institute of African Studies. We will be having videos of the various sessions posted. It may take some time for us to accomplish this, but we will be posting YouTube videos of the presentation. So please keep an eye open for them there. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, perhaps I can add just my 2 cents worth on reflections of Mwalimu Nyerere. And this came out somewhat of the session that we had before lunch where the question of refugees was raised. And my area of work is on refugees. It's been my pleasure to be working on the question of refugees in Tanzania for over 12 years. And in fact, my first time in Tanzania was as a visiting researcher at the Center for the Study of Forced Migration at the University of Dar es Salaam. And it was a wonderful experience and a wonderful welcome that I had. And I think it's important to mention that for many, the treatment of refugees, the approach to refugees, is one of the great legacies of Julius Nyerere. In fact, shortly after achieving independence, Tanzania established itself as one of the most generous countries to refugees in Africa, if not the world. And guided by principles of African solidarity and Pan-Africanism and self-reliance, Tanzania hosted tens of thousands of refugees, not only from wars of national liberation, but also from conflicts in neighboring states, especially from Rwanda and Burundi. And unlike today, these refugees were not housed in camps, but guided by the philosophy of Ujamaa and villagization, these refugees were housed in open settlements where they were encouraged and supported to be self-reliant. And they were not only able to support themselves, but make important contributions to the local economy. Now, as we discussed very briefly, there have been a number of changes in Tanzania's refugee policy over the years. The closure of the border with Burundi in March 1995 and the forced return of Rwandan refugees in December 1996. However, there is a very current development in Tanzania that reminds us that the legacy of Nyerere is very important. Tanzania has again distinguished itself by giving citizenship to over 162,000 Burundians who've been living in the settlements since 1972. This is an unprecedented solution for refugees, not only in an African context, but in a global context. And Tanzania deserves congratulations and support for seeing this through to its end. But for me, there's a very important link to Julius Nyerere. And this was impressed upon me about a year and a half ago when I was in the Katumba refugee settlement just outside of Mpanda. And when you visit the health center at the Katumba refugee settlement, there's a plaque at the front, opened by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, 1976. And so this principle of self-reliance, of solidarity, the principle of providing solutions for refugees is a legacy of Julius Nyerere, which I believe has been revisited in an extraordinary way with Tanzania, and I congratulate Tanzania for what it is that they have done. So what we see is that there are many ways that history connects with the contemporary. And to that end, we're extremely fortunate to have as our keynote speaker someone who's not only been a witness to the extraordinary history of Tanzania, but has been an active participant in many very different ways, and very exciting ways. The Honorable Mzee Kinana has a career of public service to Tanzania and to the region that spans more than 40 years. In 1972, he retired from the Tanzanian military with the rank of colonel after 20 years of service. He's been a central figure in the government of Tanzania, holding the posts of Deputy Minister of Defense, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Defense. And he was a member of Parliament for Arusha for 10 years. But he's also been a very important figure in the region. He was the chairman of the Committee of Defense Ministers for SADC in 1994-95, and he's been the Speaker of the East African Assembly from 2001 until quite recently. Right. He was also centrally involved in efforts of regional states to respond to the Rwandan civil war and genocide in the 1990s, which is, of course, a very important and difficult chapter in that region's history. While we all remember the profound effect of this conflict and the genocide that it had on Rwanda and its own people, it's important to remember the impact that it also had on neighboring states. For example, Tanzania hosted nearly 1 million refugees by the end of 1995 as a result of civil war in Burundi and in Rwanda. And on the 28th, 29th of April alone, some 250,000 refugees crossed the Rumonge Bridge into Ngara, Tanzania. In one 24-hour period, Tanzania received 250,000 refugees. It remains the single largest movement of humans in recorded history. And Mzee Kinana was centrally involved in efforts to respond to the many challenges posed by the conflict and genocide in Rwanda. He was co-chair of the Rwandan peace process in 1994. Then, from 1995 to 1996, he was the special envoy of the President of Tanzania to the Great Lakes region. It was also at this time that Mzee Kinana became chair of the Tanzanian Red Cross Society, a very important group that became centrally involved in efforts to respond to the human needs of this crisis. With this wealth of experience and this unique perspective, we are indeed privileged to have Mzee Kinana with us today, as we've been privileged to have him with us for the past day and a bit. Not only to present his thoughts on the themes of this conference, but we're also very privileged to have what I believe is a world premiere of your film. That we will be not only hearing the keynote address, but we'll then be watching a short film that Mzee Kinana has prepared on the life of Mwalimu Nyerere. So Mzee Kinana, karibu sana.
Asante. thank the organizers, particularly Martin and Blair, Paul and his wife, Patricia, for making it possible for me to come over to Canada and participate in this great event. I also extend my warm appreciation and good evening to my colleagues, countrymen and women in Dar es Salaam, and particularly to Professor Mpangala, whom I can see there. Let me say how honored I am to speak about the legacy of Julius Nyerere, our first president, a great African statesman, a personality who remains a role model for the aspiring leaders. A young gentleman a few minutes ago said we should stop talking about Julius Nyerere and we should act on what he believed and what he stood for. I totally agree with him, and I think we should all make an effort to interpret what Mwalimu stood for. And stop talking about what he has been preaching. Because Julius Nyerere was a great man, we in Tanzania, we are always proud to have him as the founder of our country. He has been in the center of many decisive struggles of our continent and of our humanity. His words as well as deeds, his achievements like his mistakes, have remained a mirror on which we look and to see where we are and how to overcome both the present and future threats and challenges facing our country, Tanzania. As we sit here at this Institute of Higher Learning, I'm obliged to touch on his contributions in education. He was an educator and creative educational thinker. Before launching his political career, as you all know, he was a teacher. His philosophy of education created interest, relevance, and inspired many within the circles of education, of policymakers and practitioners. He advocated rounded humanitarian education, which was not elitist, which did not divorce in its participants from the society, and which encouraged productive work. In an intellectual of his caliber, Nyerere believed that education had to work for the common good, foster cooperation, promote equality, and liberate man, a factor which was referred to many times by the speakers in Dar es Salaam. Further, it had to address the realities of life in the society and intended to serve. In this respect, Julius Nyerere shared the vision of the great educators of our century, Aquinas and Tagore. Nyerere's educational philosophy was based on education for self-reliance and on adult education. To him, education was a lifelong learning process and a tool for liberation of man from the restraints and limitations of ignorance and dependency. His vision of education for self-reliance was to prepare Tanzanians not only to be employed, but also to employ themselves and take their rightful place in the society. Under his philosophy, education became not only a right for every citizen in Tanzania, but compulsory for every child. With this policy, Tanzania achieved a high enrollment in schools under the Universal Primary Education with mass adult literacy campaign. His commitment to social justice and equality were the pillars of his intellectual life. Under his leadership, Tanzania achieved the highest literacy in Africa. At one point, it achieved 92%. He used his powerful oratory skills, argued his case, analyzed, and wrote not only as philosopher king, which he was, but was with a commitment to humanity. His vision for Tanzania was based upon the interests of the poor and the voiceless of the world. When we discuss the legacy of Julius Nyerere, we remind ourselves of one of his greatest achievements, and that is of building a strong national identity for his people, Tanzanians. He united a country of 120 tribal groups, ethnic backgrounds, different religious denominations. He was characterized by his ability to transcend ethnicity, creed, color, and social differentiation. He was able to inspire and mold and nurture our national identity, which Tanzanians are proud of in a continent marred by ethnic conflicts and tribal differences. Mwalimu, the teacher, as he was fondly known in Tanzania and world over, remains the beloved citizen of Tanzania, surely the most respected African statesman, an outstanding leader of the world, and an admired international personality. In 1967, as you all know, he introduced the famous Arusha Declaration with the ambition to mold the nation under strong fundamental principles of equality, dignity, but most importantly, which is talked about today in Tanzania, is the strict leadership code of conduct. The Arusha Declaration, which stood on two pillars, Ujamaa meaning socialism and Kujitegemea self-reliance, became the blueprint of socialist Tanzania. Its objective was to emancipate every man and woman from the three enemies identified at the time of independence, and that is poverty, ignorance, and disease. The declaration was an attempt to build an independent, egalitarian society based on equality and dignity for all, a society in which all members shared equal rights and equal opportunities, in which all may have a gradually increasing level of material welfare before any individual lives in luxury. With the Arusha Declaration, the government embarked, as you realize, on massive nationalization. Immediately after the Arusha Declaration, Nyerere had this to say on the Arusha Declaration. A short time after independence, a privileged group was emerging from the political leaders and bureaucrats who had been poor under colonial rule, but were now beginning to use their positions in the party and government to enrich themselves. This kind of development would alienate the leadership from the people. So we came with a new national objective. We stressed that the development is all about people and not just a small and privileged minority. The Arusha Declaration was, Mwalimu says, what makes Tanzania distinctly Tanzanian. We stated what we stood for, we laid down a code of conduct for our leaders, and we made an effort to achieve those goals. These founding socialist principles enabled Tanzania to survive the challenges of the post-colonial evils of tribalism, regionalism, and religious intolerance. In fact, Mwalimu Nyerere took measures to address tribal and religious imbalance in all matters of social justice and participation in national affairs. For example, and this was referred by someone in Dar es Salaam, when he realized how the failure to ensure equal access to education among children of different denominations could contribute to religious discord, he initiated legislation and nationalized all schools owned by religious institutions to allow admission to children of all other religions equal access. Nyerere was always decisive to speak and to take actions towards those who attempted to sow seeds of social divide in politics and in other platforms. He remained a politician of principle, of intelligence, and he was firm and fair. Accountability, transparency, and elaborate welfare system, and empowerment of the people, all these attributes that the poor communities advocate today in Tanzania were part of Nyerere's socialist packet in Ujamaa. Nyerere created an ombudsman to check on abuses of office and corruption, which today is a subject for discussion in Tanzania. We may discuss policy errors he made, but we cannot fail to agree that he had a vision and was committed to the welfare of his people. Some of his socialist experiments may have failed, but the fundamental principles he espoused remain the pillars of the country he molded and the identity of the people he left behind. It was this ideology that united the Tanzanian people and attracted those from afar into Tanzania. Unfortunately, despite his great vision and good intentions, the socialist policies of Mwalimu Nyerere did not provide the country with the hopes for lofty objectives. A few years during a worldwide slump, and before he stepped down, the country became highly indebted, the economy was in bad shape, social services like education, health, and water were drastically affected, infrastructure deteriorated, and lack of foreign exchange made it difficult to import fuel, machinery, raw materials, spare parts, and other necessary consumables. Nationalized property fell in the hands of inexperienced and greedy managers, and production came to a near standstill, leading to the introduction of rationing of whatever little was produced. Bureaucracy became inefficient, and corruption slowly entangled the administration in the delivery of goods and services. Nyerere, who was genuinely persuaded by and committed to Ujamaa, could not change the internalized individualism of the majority of his lieutenants. Socialism, he claimed, was an attitude of mind and hoped to convert people by moral preaching. Unfortunately, he never really came to grips with the forces, national as well as international, which he was setting out to defeat. The International Monetary Fund for 6 years demanded on Nyerere to accept the conditions under the structural adjustment program, and Nyerere refused to accept them. Speaking about Mwalimu Nyerere automatically brings to mind the other giants of liberation struggle, the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Ahmed Ben Bella, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Kenneth Kaunda, Amilcar Cabral, and many others. They all shared a common objective: total freedom for Africa. Unfortunately, some did not live long enough to fulfill their contributions. Mwalimu Nyerere was blessed to live and lead this noble cause. He was very firm and uncompromising in the struggle for freedom and justice. For him, this cause transcended national and continental borders. To quote the words of the late Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, he said the following, and I quote, "Everywhere there was oppression, there was Julius Nyerere fighting that oppression," unquote. Nyerere fought for the people of South Africa as he fought for the people of Guyana. He made submission for the people of Western Sahara. He spoke for the black people of the United States as he spoke for the minorities in Africa and elsewhere. He was a man of principle, of strong conviction, and he stood by them, even sometimes paying a huge price. On many occasions, very bravely, he made it clear that Tanzania's independence was meaningless as long as other countries in the continent remained under colonialism and apartheid. His unreserved commitment to the liberation struggle is something that we have many times discussed here. And in many cases, most of the difficulties he encountered with the Western powers had little to do with bilateral relations, but more with his stand on matters of principle. His support to the people of Vietnam against the United States aggression to China over the question of its rightful position in the United Nations, his commitment towards the liberation of Palestine, and his firm stand against the apartheid system in South Africa stand as classic examples on how he always remained the embodiment of justice, equality, and freedom in the world. When apartheid South Africa tried to introduce a so-called non-aggression pact with the frontline states, though some member states bought the idea, Nyerere vehemently opposed it. He went to the United Nations and argued decisively against the idea, noting as apartheid itself, he said, constituted aggression. It is impossible for one to institute a non-aggression pact with aggression itself. Fittingly, the OU Liberation Committee was headquartered in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, the city in Tanzania, the city which became the crossroad of Africa. In another example of his commitment to the cause of liberation was the welcome given by Tanzania to refugees from the former colonies and from South Africa, as you had correctly mentioned. Land, resource for development, and education was set aside for their needs. Mwalimu's monumental enduring achievement is the role he played in the liberation struggle in Southern Africa to the ultimate victory of Frelimo in Mozambique, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, SWAPO in Namibia, ANC in South Africa, and MPLA in Angola. I had the privilege, immediately after he stepped down, of traveling with Mwalimu Nyerere to these liberated countries after his retirement. It was fascinating to witness the dignified reception he was given by the leaders and the people of the newly liberated countries, and not surprisingly, far greater than those accorded to sitting heads of state. On our African continent, Nyerere will be remembered for his quest for freedom and human dignity. The world knows about South Africa's Nelson Mandela, but seemingly forgets that Mwalimu Julius Nyerere was a major world influence behind Nelson Mandela's cause for freedom and liberation. Without Nyerere's significant effort, the world would not have had the Mandela success story as is presented to us today. Let me take you through some pages of history. In 1959, Nyerere and Archbishop Trevor Huddleston founded the anti-apartheid movement in Britain. It attracted a total of membership of 700 organizations and 18 million people. Nyerere's continued effort to mobilize international support for the release of Mandela and the dismantling of apartheid was evidenced by the fact that South Africans from all walks of life and from all races mourned Julius Kambarage Nyerere, paying great tribute to his role in liberating their country. they were honest enough to admit that their anti-apartheid victory freed blacks as well as whites. Addressing a banquet in honor of Julius Nyerere in Johannesburg in 1997, the then President Nelson Mandela paid a moving tribute to Mwalimu when he said, and I quote, "I had the privilege of meeting Julius Nyerere as the newly independent country's president in 1962, seeking help as we embarked on the armed struggle. Then, as now, I was struck by his lucid thoughts, his burning desire for justice everywhere, and his commitment to Africa's interest. The people of Tanzania gave instinctive support," these are the words of Mandela, "to the liberation of South Africa," unquote. Many economists agree that Tanzania could possibly have had a better economy if it did not accept the sacrifices for the freedom of the continent. Mwalimu was true to his principles and his vision. At the end, his vision for a liberated Africa was achieved. Anyone who discusses the lives and times of Julius Nyerere cannot escape traveling the historical path of his role in uniting the continent. He was a Pan-Africanist who strove tirelessly with full commitment to unite the continent. His active engagements in the discussions and consultations preceding the formation of the Organization of African Unity provided guidance in forging a new architecture for the African unity. His stance, warnings, and the way he faced up to challenges still offers us the best way forward. He advocated a gradual and evolutionary approach to creating regional associations that would ultimately become the building blocks of the African Union. His pragmatic approach was adopted as opposed to the positions advocated by President Kwame Nkrumah and Ahmed Sékou Touré for a united continental government. Out of his approach emerged the first African attempt at regional integration, the East African Community. To ensure his vision is achieved, Nyerere was willing, and this was said many times here, to delay his country's independence, to wait for his neighbors, Kenya and Uganda, to become free so that he could together forge a political union. His argument was that it would be far more difficult to persuade a state to abandon its privileges once it attains full sovereignty. Whatever everyone failed to reckon with was the fact that he, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, virtually alone among his African peers, was willing to hold his ambitions in check for the benefit of a wider regional integration. Failing to realize that, he went to establish the United Republic of Tanzania, a union consummated by Tanganyika and Zanzibar. After more than 4 decades, I am happy to say that the union remains an important example of resilience, viability in uniting the African people. Not saying that it doesn't have any problem. Nyerere played a leading role in the formation of the Southern African Development Community. It was transformed from the frontline states and an organ for liberation of the liberation struggle in Southern Africa. Today, SADC is one of the most formidable regional organizations with the East African community in the continent. Indeed, in one sentence, one can say that Julius Nyerere embodied the African spirit. Nyerere's faith on the cause of an egalitarian society transcended national borders. These values can be traced from his strong Catholic faith and intellectually from his years in Edinburgh University, where he was influenced by the Fabian Society. Julius Nyerere was an uncompromising advocate of the non-aligned movement. He made clear from the beginning that no one would choose a friend or an enemy for Tanzania and for the other member states of Africa. In emphasizing the need for his policy, Nyerere explains what he meant by non-alignment. And he says, I quote, "By non-alignment, we are saying that to the big powers that we also belong to this planet. We are asserting the right of small or weaker nations to determine their own policies in their own interests and to have an influence on the world affairs which accords with the right of all peoples to live on earth as human beings equal with other human beings." Nyerere maintained a good relationship with the leaders from both sides of the ideological divide. Among the leading development supporters, in his socialist-oriented projects in Tanzania were Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, the United States, Britain, and Canada. Nyerere and the former Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, became intellectual as well as political friends. His close relationship with Prime Minister Trudeau established a lasting relationship between Canada and Tanzania. Among the fruits of this relationship was Canada's involvement in supporting different development projects in Tanzania, including the famous Hanang wheat farming project in Arusha. The two leaders also worked together in the struggle against colonialism and apartheid. When he retired, Trudeau worked with Mwalimu Nyerere and other world leaders such as Bruno Kreisky of Austria, Carlos Perez of Venezuela, Jules Joop of the Netherlands, and Olof Palme of Sweden to initiate a world nuclear-free. The strong bond established by Nyerere and Trudeau created the foundation of current cooperation in key areas of political, commercial, and development activities between our two countries. It is of particular significance that the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, selected Tanzania in the African continent as one of the few countries of concentration for Canadian development assistance. Mwalimu had come to the conclusion that the concept of aid was wrong. He argued that aid is a helpful palliative but not a solution to the problem of world poverty. He argued that aid is wrong in principle since ultimately it reduces poor countries to the status of beggars. In Nyerere's view, the poor want fair trade, and hence the current slogan of fair trade and not aid. Africans want fair prices for exported commodities from the developing world and for imported manufactured goods from the industrialized countries. One of his last duties was to create the South Commission, a third world intergovernmental think tank that he chaired between 1995 and 1999 when he passed away. His service to that commission put his vision, his unique strategies, and political acumen in the service of the third world and its development. He worked closely with outstanding leaders such as Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia, Manmohan Singh of India, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, and other leaders from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Through this institution, developing countries actively advocated on the importance of South-South cooperation in areas of trade and investment and in forging common positions on issues of negotiations between the North and the South. In 1985, after 24 years as president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere voluntarily stepped down, opting to retire to his village where he lived modestly. His decision to step down only added to his high regard in which he was held. In retirement, he lived on a small pension, which many of us don't do. Even after retirement, he took important responsibilities both in Africa and internationally. So 10 years have passed since Julius Nyerere's death. It is fitting to acknowledge the lasting legacy he endured to the common cause of human dignity and African unity, since such remain among the greatest achievements of his. As we remember him, we need to emphasize that Africa and the world need his leadership qualities of integrity, commitment to serve his people and humanity, abstention from luxury, and belief in simplicity and humanity. Many African leaders have risen to power only slowly and systematically, slipping into corruption, cronyism, and despotism. Nyerere remained selfless and dignified, a virtue which makes him exemplary. Mwalimu was not a rich man who could bribe people to support him. He did not use public office to enrich himself or his extended family members. He was not from a dominant tribe that treated him like demigod. His authority was primarily moral, derived from the cardinal principles of ethics and through honesty and charisma. Besides his wisdom and his integrity, his powerful personality and modesty in power, Nyerere was also special in high standards, which he set for the African leadership. Mwalimu lived a simple life in harmony with his message and the values of truth and justice for which he espoused. Incorruptible and fully accountable, his life and his work set an example that challenged his country, his people, the rest of Africa, and the world. Even after his death, Nyerere remains one of Africa's quintessential men of the 20th century. His personal probity was unequaled in many ways. Nyerere was the conscience of Africa. It was his intellectual strength and moral fiber that enabled him, when he made mistakes, to admit them openly. His humility and his towering greatness can be testified by his willingness to admit his mistakes, which many of us don't do today. When an interviewer asked Nyerere why he retired, he politely responded that he was stepping down, and listen carefully, to allow others to correct on what he failed. How often modern leaders ever follow this path of integrity? Even when it was suggested to him to extend his term of office in 1995, he responded as follows, and I quote, "I do not think I can make in 5 years what I could not achieve in 24 years, unquote. President Andrew Jackson of the United States said once that any man worth his salt will stick up for what he believes, but it takes a slightly better man to acknowledge instantly and without reservation that he's in error. As he was stepping down, Julius Nyerere admitted his mistakes and apologized to Tanzanians. How many of us can do so today? In his farewell speech on the 4th of November, 1985, as he was stepping down, Nyerere said the following, and I quote, "Since we began to govern ourselves, I have been the leader of Tanganyika and then of the United Republic of Tanzania. Time again you have re-elected me, thus expressed your confidence in my ability to do the job you needed done. And in the last few weeks, you have paid many tributes to my work as president of our country. You have forgiven, even if you have not forgotten, my mistakes of commission and of omission." After retirement, Nyerere Tanzania coined a title to honor him. He became known as the father of the nation. Even after retirement, he wielded tremendous influence in Tanzania and beyond. His not so visible hand was evident in many of the major decisions by the country's leadership on big issues of the day. One of Mwalimu's greatest successes was that he managed to remain relevant nationally, continentally, and even internationally. Hence the discussion today, after he had given up formal office. Before I conclude, I wish to thank the Honorable Deepak Oberoi for bringing the statement from the Honorable Prime Minister. As you all know, the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, is currently chairing an important commission with Tanzania's President Jakaya Kikwete, whose objective is to reduce appalling mortality rates among women and children in the developing world. For 30 years, I wish to recognize the role of Carleton. Carleton had been dedicated to Tanzania, and there has been a long-term Carleton and the University of Dar es Salaam exchange program. Last evening, the Speaker of the House of Commons, which I attended, hosted a dinner. Honorable Peter Milken hosted a fundraising dinner to contribute to this noble cause. On behalf of the staff and students of the University of Dar es Salaam, I extend to all of you our deep appreciation and gratitude for this support and for contributing to Tanzania-Canada relations. Julius Nyerere provided intellectual and moral leadership. Incorruptible and fully accountable, his life and work set an example that challenges his countrymen, Africa, and the rest of the world. Nyerere remains a very important person today and tomorrow. Finally, Mwalimu was the teacher, as we called him. He taught us two important lessons, which I will leave them with you today. How not to govern, and more positively, the virtues of retiring voluntarily, as he did in 1985, thus giving honor to the democratic process of leadership. I thank you all. The next part of my presentation is going to be a documentary which I made on the life and times of Julius Nyerere.
Julius Nyerere was born on April 13, 1922 in Butiama, Tanganyika, to a local Zanaki chief called Nyerere Burito. At the age of 12, he began his education at the government primary school in Musoma, walking 26 miles each day to attend classes. He completed his schooling a year later. He was then transferred to Tabora Boys Government Secondary School in 1943 and later moved on to Makerere University in Uganda for a certificate in education. In 1949, he became the first Tanganyikan to study in Britain, where he obtained a Master's of Arts in History and Economics at the University of Edinburgh. In 1954, he developed the Tanganyika African National Union, which grouped together nationalist factions towards an agenda for independence and self-reliance for the country. Nyerere was forced by the colonial authorities to choose between his teaching career and his interest in political activities. He was reported as saying that he was a schoolmaster by choice and a politician by accident. In due course, he entered the Legislative Council in 1958 to become the Chief Minister in 1960. A year later, Tanganyika was granted internal self-government and Nyerere became Prime Minister. Nyerere's integrity, his ability as a political orator and organizer, and his readiness to work with different groupings was a significant factor to achieving independence without bloodshed. In this, he was helped by the cooperative attitude of the last British governor, Sir Richard Turnbull.
God Save the Queen would be replaced by God Bless Africa.
Tanganyika got full independence in December 1961, and a year later he was elected president of the republic in 1962.
Head of a state is a head of a state. If you cough, people say that fellow's coughing, and then you are advised as head of a state, and you are.
During his political career, Nyerere grew to become one of the most respected and a leading figure in Africa through his messages of peace, unity, and his commitment to the liberation of the African people. He was instrumental in the creation of the Organization of African Unity and made his country the headquarters of the liberation movements in the continent. Nyerere believed in the gradual approach of the African unity through regional blocs. He was so determined to build the East African Federation that he offered to delay the independence of Tanganyika so that the three East African countries, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika, would attain independence on the same day as a collective entity in order to unite under one government. Unfortunately, the leaders in the other two countries did not reciprocate his feelings. Nyerere never gave up. In 1964, he engineered the Union of Tanganyika and Zanzibar, the first such union of independent countries on the African continent, and he remained committed to the goal of African unity on a continental scale until his last days. The East Africa Community was founded in 1967 as an economic association of East African countries. It began with a declaration of intent between Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda to improve trade, communications, and economic development. Due to political differences and foreign interference, the community broke in 1977. However, a new East African community, which includes Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, was officially relaunched in 1999 in Tanzania's northern town of Arusha. A few years later, Burundi and Rwanda also joined. As president, Nyerere had to steer a difficult course. By the late 1970s, Tanzania was one of the world's poorest countries. Like many others, it was suffering from a severe foreign debt, a decrease in foreign aid. The emerging of classes of the haves and the poor concerned him. Instead of leaders becoming servants, they developed the appetite for wealth. This led to Nyerere to come with a new policy to correct the growing gap. The Arusha Declaration of 1967 was a blueprint for establishing a more egalitarian society, which placed emphasis on self-reliance and avoided dependence upon foreign loans. The strategy entailed state ownership of major means of production and important services. Consequently, commercial banks, mills, commercial farms, and leading import and export houses were nationalized. More importantly, he introduced the leadership code. Nyerere, who was fondly known as Mwalimu, the teacher, argued that Tanzania had to move from being a nation of individual peasant producers, adopting the incentives and the ethics of the capitalist system. Instead, gradually building a nation of Ujamaa villages where the people would cooperate directly in small groups, which would further produce and equally share the benefits.
We collectivized agriculture in Tanzania. We never did. There are a bunch of fools who keep saying, you collectivized agriculture and that is why. We never did. And the Arusha Declaration states very clearly that if you are going to build socialism, it has to be voluntary. And we define a Ujamaa village, we say it's a village where people live together, work together for the common good. They cannot live together, work together for the common good if you are going to force them. They won't work together. So that is the first thing. We have not tried to force collectivization. Never. There was never a movement of forcing people to put their farms together and work together. So you have to persuade. And since you are persuading people, we envisaged from the very beginning that it was going to take a long time. And it's a process, and it's a process. We can take you now to villages in Tanzania where there is complete collectivization, complete, voluntary and complete. And we can take you to areas, villages, most of them in Tanzania, where there is very little collectivization. Most of the peasants are still working on their own farms. Fine, we have no problem. What we want is to help the peasant on his plot, to produce the maximum, and we realize beyond that they will have to cooperate. They'll have to cooperate together.
Julius Nyerere believed in the people-centered socialism. Humanness in its fullest sense rather than wealth creation must come first. Societies became better places through the development of people. The policy focus was on human development and self-reliance, which brought some success in key areas, notably in health, education, and political identity. He believed that for long the economy of Tanzania would depend on agriculture and animal husbandry as a means by which Tanzanians could live without depending on foreign assistance if they used their land properly. Land was the basis of human life, and all Tanzanians would use it as a valuable investment for future development. The government endeavored to see to it that it was being used for the benefit of the whole nation and not for the benefit of one individual or just a few people. It was the responsibility of the government and the cooperative societies to see to it that the people got the necessary tools, training, and leadership in modern methods of agriculture. To implement the policy of self-reliance effectively, the people had to be taught the meaning of self-reliance and its practice to become self-sufficient in food, shelter, and reliable social services.
So we built our leader, deliberately we build up our leader, and he also becomes this symbol of the new order. This is a dilemma of this movement. Sometimes you build the leader to the extent that at the end, when you think you have become free, the fellow has become so powerful you don't know what to do with him. It's inevitable. We don't know how you do it. Then apart from this, from the fact that we build this actually during the movement itself, the traditions are such that power is understood in our own countries in terms of the individual. It used to be the chief, then it became the governor. Colonialism didn't help us very much in building institutions. It's only now that we are trying to build institutions, to institutionalize government, to make it collective. What is a cabinet to us? You talk traditionally the idea of a cabinet government. But my university professors here understand it. But what is the idea of a cabinet government to the population here?
By the mid-1970s, the Tanzanian economy began to falter rapidly as a result of the rapid decline in exports and Tanzania's inability to import even the most basic commodities. Foreign aid decreased, with IMF imposing conditionalities and the increased demand to repay loans. The economy was affected adversely by the oil shocks of the 1970s, by drought, and the war against the dictatorship of Idi Amin in Uganda also hit the economy of Tanzania.
The IMF is no longer being used for the purposes for which it was founded. It was founded at the end of the First World War by the developed countries, basically, frankly, by the United States and Britain. They are the founders, and until now, they are the controllers, quite frankly. They are the ones who have to decide what the organization is going to do. It was intended to be an instrument to avoid the economic problems that beset the developed world after in between the wars, after the First World War. That was their purpose. We were not there. India was not there. The so-called Third World was not there. That organized, the Bretton Woods instruments were never intended for the Third World. They were intended to deal with the problems of the First World. I think the difference between myself and some of my colleagues is that I say so. I'm saying so. The IMF, the conditions of the IMF as they are, they're very rough for the poor countries. And I'm saying they're enough. Of late, there is a new condition. And this is of late. It's not in the charter of the IMF. It's a new conditionality. It's the whispers, more than whispers. If you don't have an agreement with the IMF, we will not give you aid. This is terrible. The IMF, I'm saying, has now abandoned the purpose for which it was established. It was not a conspiracy. The way it is being used against us is not a conspiracy in the sense that it was founded to deal with our problems. It never was founded to deal with our problems. But in the course of time, it was discovered that it's very useful. It's a very good instrument of controlling the economies of the Third World, of changing the policy, the direction of policies of the Third World countries. It's a good instrument that can be used. And this is what it's being used for now. It's an instrument of control. It's an instrument of destabilization of the Third World. And so I say so, because it's a fact. This is what is happening. And I'm saying to Africa, please watch out. Watch out. See what has happened when a country has signed an agreement with IMF. You see what has happened. It's a problem. I'm not saying poor countries should not be asked to tighten their belt. They're tightening their belt all the time. I've just been saying, the people of Tanzania have been tightening up their belts all these last 6 years. But they go beyond that. Tighten more, tighten more. What is the purpose? It's never development, so that you may be able to pay the banks. It is tightening the belts for the purpose of private enterprise and the ability to pay the banks. But I'm saying this is wrong.
Mwalimu Nyerere was at the forefront of the most pressing issues for Africa at that time, the liberation struggle. He led the campaign to support the liberation struggle, and all these liberation movements based in Tanzania, including those from South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, establishing military camps for training for the freedom fighters in Tanzania. Apart from the political fight in the international arena, Tanzania was also host to hundreds of thousands of refugees from many of these countries, including the ethnic torn countries of Burundi and Rwanda. The assistance provided by Tanzania did not stop at giving refuge and the military training. Mwalimu also worked hard to bring the various factions of the liberation movements together even before total independence. In South Africa, apartheid had taken a tight grip. Anti-apartheid leaders, Nelson Mandela among many more, were in prison. Those young leaders who emerged later, such as Steve Biko, were murdered. Tanzania led the struggle for dismantling of the apartheid and for the release of Nelson Mandela. The activist role of Nyerere played in advocating the welfare of Africans. He was invited to address the first post-apartheid parliament in South Africa after the regime was voted off by overwhelming votes.
About Africa south of the Sahara. You are isolated from the centers of power. There is no internal problem, there is no internal urge in the United States or in Europe or in Japan to help Africa. None. And I think to some extent the age of imperialism has gone. So you could easily be forgotten. Africa is out of interest when we are killing one another. We arouse a lot of interest. If we want to appear in European on European television, we can cause more trouble somewhere. Africa south of the Sahara is isolated. Africa south of the Sahara, in the world of today, is on its own. Totally on its own.
Nyerere, as a man of integrity, was always ready to accept mistakes both in policy and in practice.
To friends, I can admit, and we have made a number of mistakes. I think one of them I spoke about yesterday. Only yesterday I was speaking about one of them. We nationalized whatever industries we had. We have few industries around 67 when we became independent, and around 67. One of the major, and industrially we really did not have many industries to nationalize. But we had a very highly developed sisal industry based on estates. It was already beginning to run into some difficulty because of the world prices. The prices were going down. And we nationalized it. It was a mistake. It is quite clear it was a mistake. We did not have the management, the local management, to manage those farms. We nationalized some. We didn't nationalize all the farms. We nationalized some estates and left others, and this has proved the others which we left, which we did not nationalize, are doing much better than those we nationalized, although of course they had to function in the same economic situation in the world. And the basic problem was that we simply did not have sufficient management. The management was not well developed. In this case, we made a mistake. That's one mistake. It's one example of the type of mistake we made. I think also institutionally we made mistakes. We abolished the cooperative movement. I think we shouldn't have abolished the cooperative movement. Once again, centralization. It was a mistake. To centralize, you need a lot of ability to be able to centralize. And it's better to commit the mistake of the people themselves with their little experience and continuously gaining their experience, running small cooperative unions. It's better to commit the mistake there than to run the risk of centralization. When you make a mistake there, the mistake is very serious.
Julius Nyerere, as Tanzania's president, philosopher king, shaped the country's policies and image to his own designs, moving later in his career into a new role as international proponent of the Third World Cooperation.
But I go out, and sometimes I get annoyed, but sometimes I don't get annoyed. Here I am, former president of my country, no problem in Tanzania. We've never had these problems that they have. But I'm an African, and they see me, and they ask me the problems of Rwanda. I said, but I don't come from Rwanda. But you come from Africa.
What's the difference?
But I don't meet everybody. I don't meet an Englishman somewhere. If Blair was to come to Dar es Salaam, I don't ask him what is happening in Bosnia. It never occurs to me. I should ask Blair, what is happening to you Europeans because of what is happening in Bosnia? If President Cole was to come somewhere, I don't ask him what is happening in Chechnya. Well, Cole could say, why are you asking me anything about Chechnya? I don't know what is happening in Chechnya. But this is not true about Africa. About Africa, Mr. President, you go, here you are, trying to build something which is a tremendous experience. But perhaps you are different, because sometimes they think South Africa is different. So perhaps they would say, but this is President Mandela, this is different, it's not... But for the likes of me, no, I'm an African. And I say, sometimes I get irritated, but then I say, why? Why do I get irritated? Because, of course I'm a Tanzanian, but what is this Tanzania? What is this Tanzania? Why should these Europeans see me as a Tanzanian? What is this Tanzania? This is something we tried to create in my lifetime. I built Tanzania. So what is this Tanzania? The Europeans are right. The North Americans are right to look at me as an African.
As African countries became independent, several African leaders like Nyerere and Kwame Nkrumah joined the non-aligned movement. Originally, non-alignment simply meant not aligned with either of the military and ideological camps.
If I go to Britain, I marvel at what has taken place. If I go to the United States, I'm overawed by the development there. If I go to China and see what they are doing, as that we can also do. That we can also do. Because it's primitive. You go into their factory, it's a primitive factory which has a roof, a leaking roof, and no cement floor, and they're producing glass there, they're producing other things. That we can do, at home. And many things like that. If you go and you find the way they're organizing their communes, they're using tradition in order to break tradition. You see, we can do that in Africa too, and many things like that. Africa has experience. If really Africa wants to be objective, China has experience, which is very relevant to what is taking place in Africa at present. This is not a good thing to say, with the others who see China as merely a threat and not some country from which we can learn. And then there are others China is doing.
He sometimes led campaigns for world peace and nuclear disarmament while allying himself closely with distinguished leaders like Pierre Trudeau of Canada, Olof Palme of Sweden, Willy Brandt of Germany, and Terje Allende of Denmark. Nyerere met Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, Queen Elizabeth of Britain, Australian Prime Minister and US President John Kennedy on bilateral and multilateral cooperation.
The President of Tanganyika, President Nyerere.
I always associate the United States with freedom. During those days when we were struggling for our freedom and having chosen the method of peace to achieve our freedom, I used to come almost annually to the United Nations organization to plead the cause of the freedom of my country. And every time I think of the United States, I think also of the freedom of my people.
Nyerere stepped down as president and Ali Hassan Mwinyi took over the reins of power. Nevertheless, Nyerere continued to be an important political figure by retaining the position of chairperson of the ruling party Chama cha Mapinduzi, which had been formed in 1977 after the amalgamation of the Afro-Shiraz Party and TANU. The principles and values that Mwalimu Nyerere stood for still arouse deep interest within and between schools of thought a decade after his death. Nyerere humbly retired from active politics and moved back to his childhood home in the village of Butiama in western Tanzania. Of the many things this son of Africa will be remembered for was his humble, peace-loving, fight against corruption, crusader of justice, and non-believer in tribal or ethnic sentiments. Nyerere traveled more widely after retiring than he did when he was president of Tanzania. He was tasked to mediate the conflict in the countries of the Great Lakes, Rwanda and Burundi, and also DRC. He passed on the duty of mediating the Burundi peace crisis to Nelson Mandela, partly due to deteriorating health. He died in a London hospital of leukemia on October 14, 1999. Tanzanians and the world mourned the death of this great son of Africa. He was given a well-deserving send-off. Julius Nyerere has left a rich legacy still loved by his people and by many others all over.
Well, I thought I should have brought some this clip to at least give you a short history of Julius Nyerere. You know.
Asante. We're very privileged, not only here but also in Dar es Salaam, to have been able to view this. And Mzee Kinana just offered that if we can find a way of more widely distributing this, we'll look into the technology of doing that, but we'll do our best. We do have 15 minutes, and Mzee Kinana has been kind enough to say that he'll take some comments and some questions. I think we'll do it in reverse order. We have two comments that have come in on our Twitter feed, and then, I never thought I'd say Twitter feed in public with a straight face, but there you go, from our Twitter feed. And then we'll take comments or questions from Dar es Salaam, given that it is 10:15 at night, and they're showing great resilience, and then we'll return to the room here. The two comments that we have from the Twitter feed, first is from someone who identifies himself as Cardinal Black. In this world, it's nigh impossible to operate in a vacuum. And he makes the point, did Nyerere reject aid while not correlating that with developing homegrown industry? Could you comment? And second, from Red Scare Bot, who says, a code of conduct for Tanzania's leaders was a pillar of Nyerere's socialism. Can you comment on its relevance today? Which I think is a point that you made. Maybe we'll take those, have those comments. If there are any comments or questions from Dar es Salaam, maybe we can have those and then invite you to respond to these points before we return to the room here. Any comments or from Dar es Salaam? I see a hand at the back, two hands at the back.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm so proud to hear from the narrator of a short history about Nyerere. I never heard it before, so thanks about that. Maybe I want to hear from you something. I know you know him well, maybe by studying or by reading somewhere, or you know him by looking or chatting with him by changing ideas. Maybe you can explain to me the major challenges, when faced with Madam Nyerere, when the period he was in power, or by writing or by saying, by enemies. But if you can, just explain to me the challenges that faced Madam Nyerere during his period of when he was in power. Thanks, only that.
Is there a second question?
Okay, thank you. From the video, we just saw that in 1980s, there were some conditionalities imposed by the IMF and the World Bank on the structural adjustment program. Now, couldn't we say that these conditionalities were, among the reasons that led him to stepping down, as he saw that what he stood for was going down in relation to what in what was being introduced, as he never liked the Western world, as we could see, but it seemed as the Eastern world that he took as his model was going down and the Western world was coming up. So for him to see or witness that his allies were going down and him to accept the Western world was like a bit hard for him to accept while he was in power. So couldn't we say that it was an explanation for him also to leave the office for others to come into office? Thank you.
Mr. Kinana.
Well, first let me start with the last question. I think it's a very intelligent question. That is absolutely correct. Some of us had the opportunity to have had many discussions with Mwalimu Nyerere, and we saw the transition from Mwalimu Nyerere to President Mwinyi. It is absolutely correct what you said, that Mwalimu had strong beliefs in the principles of socialism and self-reliance. He was very categorical about the IMF. By the time he was stepping down, he had negotiated with the IMF for 6 years, and he could not agree with them because of their conditionalities. What were the conditionalities? One, they said you have to devalue your currency. Second, you have to increase the prices of everything. And they said if I did that, then people will go into the streets, and I was not prepared to use my own policemen to fight my own citizens. So I think he was a man of principle. There were certain issues, certain principles that he believed in, and he thought he was not prepared to sign an IMF. But I vividly remember, because I joined the government, the cabinet immediately after Mwalimu. Mwalimu, when he stepped down and he saw the conditions of the country, he said, look, I was not prepared to sign with the IMF. And he called President Mwinyi, he said, look, I give you all the blessings, you can go ahead and sign with the IMF, whatever you agree with them. But I was not willing to sign with them. And for that reason, I think he stepped down. That proves that he had his own vision, he had his own principles, and he was not willing to go against them. I think you correctly put it, that because of the beliefs that he had. And those days were very hard conditionalities. And what Mwalimu believed was that the IMF, if you had to sign with the IMF, then you are signing a certificate of humiliation, not a certificate of conditionalities, and he was not ready to be humiliated. So he said, look, you wait until I go, someone else will come in, and he will be willing to talk to you. So that's how I'm going to end. The challenges that were faced by Mwalimu Nyerere, I think Mwalimu had a vision. There are certain things that he believed in. He knew how to articulate, and I think someone said here, how to articulate, he knew how to interpret major policies into something that the peasant and the workers would very easily understood. And he carried the whole population with him. And I think there was he opened a lot of forums in country for discussions. So challenges were there were very many. But he had his own way of facing these challenges, from time to time. And he would inspire the Tanzanians. Always he would come up with certain policies that would unite, galvanize, strengthen the unity or around some form of a slogan. We started with Siasa ni Kilimo, then there was Azimio la Arusha before that, and then there was sera ya kujitegemea, and then there was viwanda vidogo vidogo. He had always small policies from the bigger policy of ujamaa and kujitegemea. And I think he had the charisma and the ability to carry the population with him. And every time he had introduced a new policy, the population would very easily understand him. The other question that was asked was, how do you relate Mwalimu accepting aid, but at the same time
not developing?
Yeah. First, I think for Mwalimu, aid meant, he believed first that Tanzania would be built by Tanzanians through self-reliance, and anything that came from outside was really to support the efforts of the Tanzanians. But as you have seen, at that time the world was not very kind to us, was not very kind to the third world. We were strangled. There were new conditionalities from the IMF, and therefore he could not achieve. And because he could not achieve, he decided to step down. And as I said, he called President Mwinyi. He said, "Look, I would never sign with these people. If you want, you can go ahead and sign with them. I will not oppose you."
There are questions from the floor here. Comments, please.
Well, not so much a question as a comment, in addition to what Honorable Kinana has said, and in reaction to the question posed by somebody in Dar es Salaam, and also hinted at by a previous contributor from Dar es Salaam. This perception that Mwalimu stepped down, like throwing in the towel, that it has failed, rather than continue, let somebody else come in. I don't think it was, that was the main reason of Mwalimu stepping down. Mwalimu stepped down in 1985, but we need to remember that Mwalimu announced during the acceptance speech of his nomination for president in 1980, what was supposed to be basically, "Thank you for nominating me again." He used that as an occasion to say, "Thank you, but I'm telling you, I'm doing this for the last time." 1980, October, November, or something thereabout. So this was not an overnight thing. It's something that was that he made clear long before whatever happened in the intervening period, the conflicts and misunderstandings with the IMF, even if they predated 1980, but they cannot be used as a reason for him stepping down. And there's one other thing I want to point out with the sequence of the events leading to Mwalimu's stepping down. After he had made this announcement in 1980, there were other African heads of state, so to say, who took up decided to follow the same way, and stepped down before him, actually, though they made the decision after he had said he would step down in 1985. Many years later, I was privileged to be privy to some private comments by Mwalimu, and I remember to have heard him saying that two of these presidents, after they had stepped down, sent emissaries, each in his own time, to Mwalimu, saying, "Please don't make this mistake. Reverse your decision and stay in place."
Reconsider. Yeah.
So, but the way Mwalimu was recalling what had happened, he was amused by all of it. But I think this was a person who had his own reason, which he made very clear in 1980, that we need to have a culture of alternating leadership, and one a leader being succeeded by another leader through mechanisms that we set ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It wasn't just a matter of throwing in the towel and saying, "Let somebody else do what I couldn't do."
Thank you for that intervention. Thank you. There's another comment.
Sure. I'd be interested in because you had so much contact, your characterization of how Nyerere moved from a single party to the need for a plural system, a more plural system. I think he actually said that, after he had stepped down, but I don't remember the total detail, but he obviously had a transition of thinking over time, and I'd be interested in how you characterize that.
Well, I think he made a lot of contribution into Tanzania's moving into multi-party system. I think we should not forget at that time, I think there was this huge wave of pushing African countries, third world countries, into adopting the multi-party system. And I think in his wisdom, he thought that it would be appropriate for Tanzania to move into this transition peacefully from a single party into a multi-party system, and therefore encouraged the party which he founded to accept the multi-party system. And because of his strong influence on the party, although some sort of an opinion poll was done, and the majority said we shouldn't, but because of his, I think, influence and because of reason that prevailed and wisdom that prevailed, it was agreed that probably it would be better for Tanzania's future if we had moved into multi-party system.
Do you think he was right in that?
Yeah, I think he was. Yeah, he was. And coming from him, he ruled Tanzania for 24 years in a single party system. And here was Julius Nyerere saying, now it's time to move into multi-party system. I think it was great of him.
Very good. We have time for one last question. So yes, please.
I just want to make a comment on this. There was a big debate about this before independence in the newspapers and the opposition parties that were in place before independence. There was TANU and a couple other parties were debating this. Because Nyerere had actually made a paper where he said my intention is to have a one-party state for 15 years after independence, and then he saw that as a need for a stabilization. So that plan to step down was in place since before independence. So if he was saying in 1980, I'm going to step down, he was only saying that because he said his time has come, it's passed. And so the question remains is not why the transition, but rather why did the transition come later than he had intended? I think the Ugandan war is a part of that, but I'm sure there's other factors as well. So that's just a comment.
We may leave that as a question. I see that there's one last comment from Dar, which will have to be our last comment before we wrap this up and move on to the next panel. So the last comment from Dar. Yes, please.
Thank you. I have one observation. That is the question of Pan-Africanism. Of course, we have discussed a lot. Nyerere was a big Pan-Africanist, and I agree. But then I find a gap. How did this gap come? Because Pan-Africanism means commitment to the development of Africa, unity of Africa, independence of Africa. But Pan-Africanism is also a movement which started in Europe, 1900. It had many congresses, and then with the independence, it shifted to Africa. Congresses in Africa in Dar es Salaam, 1974, Kampala, 1994. But after independence, African leaders did not so much clearly, including Nyerere, support Pan-Africanism as a movement. And even its scope of activities declined. Although now we have a revival. That's why even in the University of Dar es Salaam, we have the Pan-African chair, Nyerere Pan-African chair, and every year in April, the birth of Nyerere, we have a week on Pan-Africanism, people coming. The revival is there, but there has been a period of decline, and I could not see any situation where Nyerere, as a Pan-Africanist, supported that movement openly.
Right. I think we may use that as a comment to allow you the last word to wrap up on this keynote panel.
Well, I think the professor is in a much better position because he's at the University of Dar es Salaam in a learning institution where probably these issues are articulated in a more detail than probably I would know. But what I think is that, sometimes you can espouse some ideas, but once you come into office, probably the what goes with your office becomes more interesting and becomes more valuable really than the principles that you advocate. That is number one. But number two, I think, is the reality, that it is not as easy to unite the whole of Africa. I think they realized that it was not very easy. It was an idealist principle from the beginning that, we could unite the whole of continent immediately after we become independent. But once independence was achieved, probably it was not something that was easy, and I think that is why they took the route of establishing the building blocks of having regional organizations like SADC, regional organizations like SADC, ECOWAS, the East African Community, and so forth. So, but in principle, I would say if Mwalimu was willing to delay his independence, the independence of Tanganyika then, to be able to unite with Kenya and Uganda, I'm sure he was a committed Pan-Africanist, more than anybody else. And I remember him saying that what the African leaders remain with today is that while they had finished the liberation struggle, the African leaders today has the mission to unite the continent. I think he did try his best to unite the continent, and he did what he could, and it is up to us now to finish the objectives.
And I think in many ways some of those objectives are still with us to realize. Unfortunately, mindful of the time, we're going to have to wrap up this panel. Before I thank our speaker, I do want to make mention of the fact that it's at this point that we lose the video feed to Dar es Salaam. And to our friends and colleagues in Dar es Salaam, I want, perhaps I could say on behalf of all of us in this room here, how special it's been for us to have you at the other end of this feed and engaged in this discussion, and how meaningful it has been to have you there and how valuable we found your contribution. I'd like to thank very sincerely our colleagues at the Canadian High Commission for everything that they have done to make this link possible, and to thank all of you for your time, and for colleagues at the DLC in Dar es Salaam for your efforts. So maybe those of us on this side here can thank our colleagues at Dar, for whom it's 10:30 on a Friday night, and they're still doing that.